He didn't raise his voice. That's the part that still unsettles me. He reached for the remote, clicked the television off in the middle of the evening news, and said, almost gently, "Get out." The room went quiet so fast I could hear the ceiling fan ticking as it slowed. The smell of reheated rice still hung in the air. I remember staring at the dark screen, my own reflection faintly staring back like I was watching someone else's life freeze. I didn't ask him to repeat himself. I didn't cry. I didn't even move. I just stood there, holding the dish towel in my hands, and stayed quiet. Because sometimes when you've been married long enough, you know that silence is the only thing keeping the ground from giving way under your feet. I stayed quiet that night. I stayed quiet when I gathered my plate and set it in the sink. I stayed quiet when he went into the bedroom and closed the door behind him like I was already gone. But silence has a way of collecting interest. And the next day, when a man I'd never seen before knocked on our door, everything he thought he had buried came walking back into the light. Before all of that, my life wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of life people pass by without noticing, and that used to make me proud. I'd been married to Raymond for 26 years. We met when I was 29 and tired of men who made promises they couldn't keep. Raymond didn't promise much. He was steady, quiet, and practical. He worked in property maintenance for a commercial firm, came home smelling faintly of paint and metal, and liked his dinners hot and simple. We raised one daughter together, Alicia. She was grown and married now, living 3 hours away with her own little family. The house had been quieter since she left. Not empty, just quieter. You learn to live in the pauses. I worked part-time at the public library. I liked the predictability of it. The soft thud of returned books, the hum of the scanners, the way people whispered without being told. On my days off, I tended the small garden in our backyard. Tomatoes, basil, a stubborn rosebush that refused to die no matter how badly I pruned it. Raymond and I had routines instead of romance. Morning coffee at opposite ends of the table, the news on at 6, dinner at 7, a show we half-watched together before bed. We weren't cruel to each other. We weren't particularly tender either. I thought that was just what long marriages turned into, like shoes that fit well but had lost their shine. Looking back, I can see the small fractures. At the time, I told myself they were normal. Raymond had started coming home later, not dramatically late, 30 minutes here, an hour there. He said staffing had changed, new contracts, more responsibility. He didn't smell like paint anymore. He smelled like a different soap. Once, when I reached for his phone on the counter because it was buzzing and I thought it might be Alicia, he covered it with his hand too quickly and said, "I've got it." I laughed it off, made a joke about him hiding a secret life. He didn't laugh. But I didn't push. I was good at not pushing. I had learned somewhere along the way that being easy was the same as being safe. The night he told me to get out started like any other. I made chicken and rice. He ate quietly. The television murmured in the background. There was a story about a missing person, a woman, I think, but I wasn't paying attention. I asked him casually, "Are you coming with me to Alicia's next weekend?" He didn't answer right away. He kept chewing, eyes on the screen. Then he said, "I'm not going." I shrugged. "Okay, I'll tell her." That should have been the end of it, but something in the way he said it, flat, final, made me glance at him. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He sighed like I'd asked him something exhausting. Why wouldn't it be? I didn't have a good answer. I wiped my hands on the towel and said softly, "You've been distant." That's when he turned off the TV. That's when he said it. Get out. Not tonight, not go stay with Alicia for a while, just get out, like the house itself was rejecting me. I remember asking very calmly, "What?" He stood up then, pushing his chair back. His jaw was tight, his eyes tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not sad, just resolved. He said, "I'm done. I want you gone." I asked if there was someone else. He didn't answer that. He just picked up his plate and took it to the sink like we were discussing groceries. He said, "I need space, and I need it now." So I stayed quiet. I slept on the couch that night. The cushion smelled like detergent and something older, memory maybe. I stared at the ceiling until morning, listening to him move around the bedroom like a stranger in a hotel. When daylight came, I made coffee. I drank it alone. I didn't pack a bag. By mid-morning, Raymond had left for work without a word. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I thought maybe it was a delivery driver who'd gotten the wrong house again. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened the door. A man stood there, holding a folder. He was about my age, maybe a little younger, clean-shaven, nervous eyes. He asked, "Are you Margaret Collins?" "Yes," I said, my stomach tightening for reasons I couldn't yet name. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I'm sorry to show up like this, but I think we need to talk about your husband." The word husband landed heavy between us. Behind him, the afternoon sun hit the driveway just right. Everything looked ordinary. But I knew in my bones that whatever was in that folder was the reason Raymond turned off the TV the night before, and I knew my quiet was about to run out. I woke before the alarm the next morning, the gray light just beginning to soften the edges of the room. Raymond lay on his side, back to me, already awake. I could tell by the way his shoulders were tense, like a man bracing for impact. Neither of us spoke. I got out of bed quietly and went to the kitchen. The house felt different in the morning, like it was holding its breath. I made coffee the same way I always did, 2 scoops, a pinch of cinnamon. Habit has a strange loyalty, even when people don't. As the kettle boiled, my mind moved through the night like I was rewinding a tape. Daniel's calm voice, the documents, Elaine's name written in a neat, confident script. 4 years of a life I hadn't known existed. I didn't want revenge, not in the dramatic sense people imagine. I wanted truth, and I wanted my dignity intact when it arrived. By 8, Raymond was dressed and heading for the door. "I'll be late," he said, not looking at me. "I know," I replied. He paused just for a moment, then left without another word. I spent the morning doing ordinary things. I folded laundry, I watered the plants. I even answered an email from Alicia about her son's school project, careful not to let my fingers shake over the keyboard. Around noon, I called a lawyer. Her name was Denise Harper. She listened without interrupting, asked precise questions, and didn't soften her words. "You need to be present for any confrontation," she said, "and you need copies of everything." "I have them," I said. "Good. And Margaret, don't move out. Not yet." I smiled faintly at that. I wasn't planning to. At 3 o'clock, there was another knock at the door. This time I knew who it would be. Elaine Parker stood on my porch, posture straight, hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She wore a blazer like she was heading into a boardroom instead of someone else's marriage. She looked surprised to see me. She started, then stopped. "You're Margaret." "Yes," I said. "You must be Elaine." Her mouth tightened. "I didn't expect." "I know," I said gently. "Please, come in." She hesitated, then stepped inside. Her eyes moved quickly around the living room, taking in the photos, the furniture, the evidence of a shared life. I wondered what Raymond had told her. Probably very little. "She thought you and Raymond were separated," she said finally. "I wasn't," I replied, "but I understand why you believe that." She sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap. "I never would have—" "I know," I said again. And I meant it. Her shock looked real. Pain usually does. I hired Daniel because the business didn't add up, she continued. I didn't know about you until later. By then, it was complicated. It always is, I said. We sat in silence for a moment, two women on opposite sides of the same lie. Raymond will be here soon. If you want to leave, I understand. She shook her head. No, I need to hear what he says. I need him to say it. So we waited. When Raymond walked in at 4:30, he stopped short. His eyes moved from me to Elaine and back again. The color drained from his face. What is this? He demanded. This, I said calmly, is the truth catching up. He laughed, sharp and defensive. You went behind my back. You went behind mine first, I replied. Elaine stood. You told me she knew. Raymond looked at her like she'd betrayed him. I told you what you needed to hear. I felt something settle in my chest then, the last piece clicking into place. You used us both in different ways. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The room was too quiet for bluster. I wanted out, he said finally. I wanted a clean break. So you tried to erase me, I said, financially, legally. He didn't deny it. Denise arrived shortly after. Papers were laid out. Words like fraud and liability hung in the air like smoke. Raymond sank into a chair, suddenly smaller. By evening, everything was exposed. The shell company, the diverted funds, the false promises. Elaine left first. She paused at the door, looked back at me. I'm sorry for my part in this. I know, I replied. Take care of yourself. When she was gone, Raymond looked at me with something close to fear. You ruined me, he said. No, I said quietly. You did that yourself. That night, he packed a bag. I watched from the doorway as he zipped it closed. He didn't ask me to stop him. When the door shut behind him, the house exhaled. I stood there alone, listening to the quiet. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. I didn't invite Daniel in right away. I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, the screen door pressing lightly against my shoulder as if it might anchor me to the moment before everything shifted. He held the folder against his chest like it was something fragile or dangerous. I don't sell anything, I said, because my mind needed something ordinary to say. He nodded quickly. I know, I wouldn't be here if there was another way. That was when I stepped aside. The living room looked the same as it always had. Couch cushions slightly sagged in the middle, the framed photo of Raymond and me at Alicia's college graduation still crooked on the wall, the television screen black, reflecting our shapes like ghosts. Daniel didn't sit at first. He stood near the coffee table, glancing around as if he was taking inventory of a life he wasn't sure he belonged in. I'll be honest, he said. I don't know how much you already know. I don't know anything, I replied. My voice sounded steady, but I felt hollow underneath it. So maybe start there. He exhaled, then opened the folder. Inside were documents, copies of checks, bank statements, a lease agreement. I'm a private investigator, he said. I was hired by a woman named Elaine Parker. The name meant nothing to me at first. I waited for the recognition that didn't come. She believed her business partner was misusing company funds. That partner is your husband. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Raymond doesn't have a business partner. He works maintenance. He hesitated. That's not entirely accurate. He slid a document across the table. It was a lease for a small office space across town. Raymond's name was printed clearly at the bottom. He's been managing several short-term rental properties under a shell company, Daniel said. Maintenance, yes, but also acquisition, leasing, renovations. The income never touched your joint accounts. I stared at the paper. I knew Raymond fixed things for extra cash sometimes, a faucet here, a broken door there, but this was structured, planned. How long? I asked. About 4 years. 4 years. I thought of the nights he came home late, the different soap, the guarded phone. And Elaine, I said, who is she? Daniel looked at me carefully before answering. She was his romantic partner. The word romantic felt too soft, like calling a storm a drizzle. I nodded once. Is. He didn't correct me. She believed they were building something together, both personally and financially. When she realized assets were being moved without her consent, she hired me. And you came to me because, I asked? Because, he said gently, some of those assets legally belong to you. He pulled out another document, a property deed. My name was on it, Raymond's too. I recognized the address immediately, a townhouse near the river. I had driven past it dozens of times without knowing it was mine. He used your credit, he said, your joint income history, but you never signed off on the withdrawals. That makes this complicated. I felt something rise in my chest then, not rage, not yet, but a sharp, almost clinical clarity. That's why he wants me out, I said slowly. Daniel nodded. If you're not living here, it simplifies his claim. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden. The rose bush was blooming again, stubborn and bright. I wondered how many mornings I'd knelt there, hands in the dirt, while my life was being rearranged behind my back. Elaine doesn't know about me, I said. She knows you exist, Daniel corrected, but not that you're unaware. I turned back to him. She thinks I'm what? Complicit? She thought you were separated, he said quietly. Of course she did. I sat then because my legs finally asked me to. Why tell me now? I asked. Daniel closed the folder. Because Elaine is planning to confront Raymond tomorrow. And because legally, you deserve to know what's happening before that door opens. Tomorrow. I pictured Raymond's face the night before, the way he'd said, get out, like it was overdue. I laughed once, short and humorless. He couldn't even wait for the confrontation. Daniel stood. He'll leave my card. Whatever you choose to do, you should speak to a lawyer. He hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. After he left, I sat in that same spot for a long time. I didn't cry, not then. I walked through the house slowly. The bedroom, the bathroom, the closet where Raymond's shirts hung, still crisp, still familiar. I touched one sleeve and let it fall back into place. That evening, Raymond came home like nothing had happened. He set his keys down, took off his shoes. You still here? He asked. Yes, I said. He frowned. I thought we were clear. We were, I replied. You want me gone, I understand. He relaxed slightly. Good, then pack. I will, after tomorrow. His eyes flicked up. Tomorrow? Yes, I said. I have a meeting. With who? I looked at him then, really looked, at the man who shared my bed, my table, my daughter's childhood, the man who thought silence meant ignorance. With the truth, I said. He stared at me, something unreadable passing over his face. Then he scoffed and walked past me into the bedroom. That night, I slept in the bed for the first time since he told me to leave. He didn't say a word. And somewhere between the ticking clock and his shallow breathing, I decided I would stay quiet just a little longer, because tomorrow, the man who thought he controlled the story was about to meet the woman who had finally learned how to listen. I woke before the alarm the next morning, the gray light just beginning to soften the edges of the room. Raymond lay on his side, back to me, already awake. I could tell by the way his shoulders were tense, like a man bracing for impact. Neither of us spoke. I got out of bed quietly and went to the kitchen. The house felt different in the morning, like it was holding its breath. I made coffee the same way I always did, 2 scoops, a pinch of cinnamon. Habit has a strange loyalty, even when people don't. As the kettle boiled, my mind moved through the night like I was rewinding a tape. Daniel's calm voice, the documents, Elaine's name written in a neat, confident script. 4 years of a life I hadn't known existed. I didn't want revenge, not in the dramatic sense people imagine. I wanted truth, and I wanted my dignity intact when it arrived. By 8, Raymond was dressed and heading for the door. "I'll be late," he said, not looking at me. "I know," I replied. He paused just for a moment, then left without another word. I spent the morning doing ordinary things. I folded laundry, I watered the plants. I even answered an email from Alicia about her son's school project, careful not to let my fingers shake over the keyboard. Around noon, I called a lawyer. Her name was Denise Harper. She listened without interrupting, asked precise questions, and didn't soften her words. "You need to be present for any confrontation," she said, "and you need copies of everything." "I have them," I said. "Good. And Margaret, don't move out. Not yet." I smiled faintly at that. I wasn't planning to. At 3 o'clock, there was another knock at the door. This time I knew who it would be. Elaine Parker stood on my porch, posture straight, hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She wore a blazer like she was heading into a boardroom instead of someone else's marriage. She looked surprised to see me. She started, then stopped. "You're Margaret." "Yes," I said. "You must be Elaine." Her mouth tightened. "I didn't expect." "I know," I said gently. "Please, come in." She hesitated, then stepped inside. Her eyes moved quickly around the living room, taking in the photos, the furniture, the evidence of a shared life. I wondered what Raymond had told her. Probably very little. "She thought you and Raymond were separated," she said finally. "I wasn't," I replied, "but I understand why you believe that." She sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap. "I never would have—" "I know," I said again. And I meant it. Her shock looked real. Pain usually does. "I hired Daniel because the business didn't add up," she continued. "I didn't know about you until later. By then it was complicated." "It always is," I said. We sat in silence for a moment, 2 women on opposite sides of the same lie. "Raymond will be here soon. If you want to leave, I understand." She shook her head. "No, I need to hear what he says. I need him to say it." So we waited. When Raymond walked in at 4:30, he stopped short. His eyes moved from me to Elaine and back again. The color drained from his face. "What is this?" he demanded. "This," I said calmly, "is the truth catching up." He laughed, sharp and defensive. "You went behind my back." "You went behind mine first," I replied. Elaine stood. "You told me she knew." Raymond looked at her like she'd betrayed him. "I told you what you needed to hear." I felt something settle in my chest then, the last piece clicking into place. "You used us both, in different ways." He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The room was too quiet for bluster. "I wanted out," he said finally. "I wanted a clean break." "So you tried to erase me," I said, "financially, legally." He didn't deny it. Denise arrived shortly after. Papers were laid out. Words like fraud and liability hung in the air like smoke. Raymond sank into a chair, suddenly smaller. By evening, everything was exposed. The shell company, the diverted funds, the false promises. Elaine left first. She paused at the door, looked back at me. "I'm sorry for my part in this." "I know," I replied. "Take care of yourself." When she was gone, Raymond looked at me with something close to fear. "You ruined me," he said. "No," I said quietly. "You did that yourself." That night, he packed a bag. I watched from the doorway as he zipped it closed. He didn't ask me to stop him. When the door shut behind him, the house exhaled. I stood there alone, listening to the quiet. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't scare me. The legal process moved slowly, like everything important does. There were meetings, signatures, long conversations where words like equitable distribution and marital assets were spoken with careful precision. Denise handled most of it, her voice calm and unyielding, like a steady hand on a wheel during rough water. Raymond tried to rush things. He wanted closure. He wanted resolution. Mostly, he wanted control back. He sent messages at first, short ones. "We need to talk. This doesn't have to be ugly. I never meant to hurt you." I didn't respond. Then the messages grew longer, more desperate. "I built everything for us. You're throwing away decades. You're letting outsiders turn you against me." I read them once, then I deleted them. The truth was, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy, and I was done giving him mine. The first time I saw him again was at mediation. We sat across from each other at a long table, a thin stack of documents between us like a border neither of us could cross. He looked tired, thinner. The confidence he once wore like armor had dulled at the edges. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly when the mediator stepped out of the room. "I already did," I replied. He sighed. "I just wanted something of my own." "That's not what you wanted. You wanted something without consequences." He looked down at his hands. When the mediator returned, we finished what needed to be finished. The house stayed mine. The townhouse by the river was sold. The funds were divided as the law allowed, not kindly, not cruelly, just fairly. When it was over, Raymond stood awkwardly by the door. "I don't know who you are anymore," he said. I thought about that. "I don't think you ever did," I replied. Outside, the air smelled like rain. I breathed it in deeply, like I was learning how to breathe again. The fallout didn't end there. At church, people avoided me at first. Some nodded politely, others looked away. I let them. Eventually, curiosity overtook discomfort. One woman sat beside me during service and whispered, "I'm glad you stood up for yourself." Another squeezed my hand after and said, "I wish my mother had done the same." Those moments mattered more than the silence ever had. Alicia came to stay one weekend. She hugged me longer than usual, her arms tight around my shoulders. I didn't want to believe it, about Dad. I know, it's hard when the truth changes the shape of your childhood. We cooked together that night, laughed about small things, avoided the big ones until we couldn't anymore. "I'm proud of you," she said finally. The words settled into me like warmth. As summer turned into fall, I found myself doing things I'd never done alone before. I took a weekend trip to the coast. I ate dinner out by myself. I sat in silence without feeling like I was waiting for someone to return. One evening, I turned the television on out of habit, then turned it off again, not because I was told to, but because I wanted to hear the quiet. It sounded like freedom. The public consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in ripples. First, it was Raymond's job. What started as a temporary suspension turned into a quiet termination. No announcement, no explanation. Just his desk emptied and his access revoked. A man who had built his identity on being dependable suddenly found himself unneeded. Then the community followed. Word has its own way of traveling, especially when it's been waiting to be told. Someone from church mentioned the investigation in a prayer circle. Someone else repeated it with details added and softened. By the time it reached the grocery store checkout line, it sounded like a cautionary tale instead of gossip. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't have to. Raymond tried to reclaim his version of the story. He called mutual friends. He showed up unannounced at places he knew I frequented. Once he waited outside the library until my shift ended. "I just want to talk," he said, standing too close. "I've said everything I need to say," I replied, stepping back. "You're enjoying this," he accused, watching me fall apart. I looked at him carefully, at the lines around his eyes, deeper now, at the hands that no longer knew what to do with themselves. "No," I said, "I'm healing." He scoffed. "You think you're better than me now." "No," I said again, "I think I'm free." That was the last conversation we had. A month later, the final papers arrived in the mail. The divorce was official. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time before opening it, not because I was afraid, but because endings deserve to be acknowledged. 26 years doesn't vanish just because ink dries. When I signed my name, my hand didn't shake. That surprised me. I framed one thing from that marriage, not a photo, not a keepsake, but a lesson. That silence is powerful, but only when it serves you. I started volunteering more at the library, mentoring younger women who came in asking about job applications or resumes. I didn't tell my story unless they asked. When they did, I told it plainly. No bitterness, no drama, just facts. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, a little sheepish. "Thought I'd check in." We sat at the small table near the window. Sunlight filtered through dust motes like quiet applause. "You did something most people can't," he said. "You didn't burn everything down." I smiled. "I didn't need to. The truth did the work for me." He scoffed. "Still, you should be proud." After he left, I stayed by the window, watching people pass. Everyone carrying something invisible. Everyone believing their story was the only one unfolding. I knew better now. Raymond faded from my life slowly. His name stopped coming up. His shadow shortened. Eventually, it disappeared altogether. What remained was mine. Healing doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes quietly, like light creeping across the floor in the early morning. I noticed it first in small ways. I stopped bracing myself when the phone rang. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't living my life. I stopped shrinking my needs to keep the peace. The house changed with me. I repainted the bedroom walls a soft, warm gray, not because Raymond disliked color, but because I wanted something that felt like calm without being dull. I moved the bed closer to the window, let the morning sun touch my face when I woke up. I planted lavender in the garden where his tools used to lean against the fence. The smell carried on the breeze in the evenings, steady and grounding. Alicia visited more often, sometimes with her children, sometimes alone. One afternoon, as we folded laundry together, she said, "I didn't realize how much you carried until you stopped." I thought about that. "I didn't either," I admitted. She hesitated. "Do you regret staying as long as you did?" I shook my head. "No, regret would mean I didn't learn anything." She smiled at that. There were still moments, of course there were. A song in the grocery store, a familiar car parked at a red light, a dream where I woke reaching for someone who wasn't there anymore. But the ache was different now, less sharp, more like a reminder than a wound. One evening, I attended a small community lecture at the library, a local author talking about resilience. I sat in the back, listening to stories that weren't mine, but felt close enough to touch. At the end, the speaker asked, "What does starting over mean to you?" Hands went up. Answers floated around the room. When it was my turn, I surprised myself by speaking. I said, "It means not lying to yourself anymore." The room went quiet. Afterward, a woman approached me. She looked tired in a familiar way. "I needed to hear that," she said. I nodded. So did I. That night, I went home and turned on the television, not out of habit, but choice. I watched a movie all the way through, laughed when it was funny, let it end without rushing to fill the silence. I thought of the night Raymond turned it off and told me to leave. How small he had sounded then, how certain. He thought power lived in control. He never understood that power also lives in restraint, in waiting, in knowing when to speak and when to let truth arrive on its own. The man who showed up at my door the next day didn't bring chaos. He brought clarity. And clarity, I learned, is a kind of mercy.
People often ask me when it finally ended. They expect a date, a signature, a slammed door, or a last argument that tied everything up neatly. But endings aren't like that, not the real ones. What ended wasn't my marriage. That was already over long before the television went dark. What ended was my habit of disappearing inside my own life to make room for someone else's comfort. For years, I thought being quiet was the same as being kind. I thought swallowing my questions made me mature. I thought endurance was love. No one ever told me that silence, when it's one-sided, slowly teaches the other person that you don't need a voice to exist. The night Raymond told me to get out, he thought he was reclaiming control. He thought he was simplifying his future. He thought my quiet meant compliance. What he didn't know, what I didn't even know yet, was that quiet can also be a doorway. Because when you stop explaining yourself to someone who's already decided who you are, you finally get to hear your own thoughts clearly. I think about that moment sometimes, the way the room felt when the television went black, the weight of his words, the way I stood there holding a dish towel like it was the last normal thing in my hands. If I could speak to that woman now, I wouldn't tell her to yell. I wouldn't tell her to fight. I wouldn't even tell her to leave right away. I would tell her this: stay long enough to see who you become when you stop begging to be understood. Because strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives dressed as patience. Sometimes it waits for the truth to walk up your driveway on its own. The man who showed up the next day didn't save me, he didn't rescue me, he didn't fix my life. He just handed me the truth and trusted me to decide what to do with it. That part mattered. So often we think empowerment has to be loud, public, immediate. But there is a quieter kind that grows in the background, unnoticed, until one day you realize you are no longer afraid of the silence. I don't hate Raymond. I don't wish him harm, but I no longer carry him. That may be the cleanest ending I could have hoped for. Now, when I sit in my living room and turn the television on or off, it's my choice. When I make plans, they don't have to fit around someone else's secrets. When I speak, my words don't have to be softened to land gently. And when I'm quiet, it's because I'm listening, not disappearing. If you're listening to this story and something in it feels familiar, I want you to hear this part clearly. You are not wrong for noticing the change in the room. You are not dramatic for asking questions. You are not difficult for wanting honesty in your own life. And you are not weak because you stayed quiet. Sometimes quiet is how we survive long enough to leave with our dignity intact. So I'll ask you the question I still ask myself from time to time. If someone turned off the noise in your life and told you to disappear, would you shrink? Or would you wait long enough for the truth to show up and speak for you? I'd love to know what you think. Would you have stayed quiet like I did or spoken sooner? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you that your voice matters, even when it's soft, then stay with me. There are more stories like this.
Stories about truth, about patience, about finding your footing again after the ground shifts. You're not alone here. There is a season after the ending that no one talks about. It's the part where nothing dramatic happens. No confrontations, no paperwork, no revelations. Just ordinary days stacked on top of each other, testing whether the peace you fought for can actually hold. That's where I found myself. I started waking earlier, not because I had to, but because my body seemed to understand that mornings belonged to me now. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my tea, the window cracked open just enough to let the outside in. Birds arguing over the fence, a neighbor's car starting, life continuing, indifferent to my past. For a long time, I thought healing meant feeling better, but what it really meant was feeling present. Present when I walked through the grocery store without scanning aisles for a familiar face. Present when I laughed without immediately wondering if it was too loud. Present when I made plans and didn't check them against someone else's mood. One afternoon, I came across an old box in the hall closet. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were things I'd saved without knowing why. Birthday cards, receipts, notes from Alicia when she was little. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper in Raymond's handwriting, a list, chores, repairs, appointments, evidence of a life run on logistics, not intimacy. I didn't feel sad when I held it. I felt relieved. I realized then that love isn't proven by how much you endure, it's proven by how much truth you're allowed to hold without fear. That realization stayed with me. A few months later, I ran into Elaine at a coffee shop across town. We recognized each other at the same time. There was an awkward pause, then a nod. She approached my table cautiously. "May I?" she asked. I gestured to the empty chair. She looked different, lighter, like someone who'd set something heavy down. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for not turning me into the villain." I stirred my coffee slowly. "We were both lied to." She nodded. "I learned something from watching you." "What's that?" I asked. She said, "That composure can be devastating," she said with a small smile. I smiled back. "It can also be freeing." We didn't become friends. We didn't need to. Some connections exist only to teach you something, then release you. When I left the cafe, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I walked through them without hurry. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. I noticed the changes I'd once ignored, the fine lines, the softness around my eyes, the steadiness in my gaze. I looked like a woman who had survived something quietly, and I liked her. People still ask if I'll ever remarry. I tell them I don't know. Not because I'm afraid, but because I'm no longer negotiating my future from a place of absence. I'm building from fullness now. That changes the questions you ask. Sometimes I think about the version of myself who believed peace meant keeping things smooth. I wish I could tell her that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of self-respect. If you're hearing this and wondering whether quiet strength really counts, let me say this plainly. It does. Not every victory needs an audience, not every truth needs to be shouted, and not every ending needs to scorch the earth to be real. Some endings arrive softly. Some justice walks in wearing ordinary clothes, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay still enough for the truth to reveal itself, then stand up and live like you are always allowed to. That's what I did. And every day since, I choose to keep doing it. There are days now when nothing reminds me of him at all. Those days arrive without announcement. No warning, no fanfare. They simply pass, gentle and unremarkable. And it's only later, when I'm brushing my teeth at night or locking the door, that I realize his absence didn't echo once. That's when I know something inside me has finished healing another layer. I didn't expect healing to be so practical. I thought it would feel emotional, dramatic, maybe even poetic. Instead, it shows up in decisions, in boundaries, in the way I no longer second-guess my instincts or apologize for needing time. I remember the first time I hosted people in the house again. Just a small gathering, Alicia, her kids, a neighbor I'd grown close to. I cooked too much food, as I always do. The house smelled like roasted garlic and warm bread. Laughter filled the rooms in a way it hadn't for years. At one point, I caught myself bracing for a comment that never came. No criticism, no sigh of impatience, no one turning the television off to silence the moment. I realized then how much of myself I'd been holding back to keep the atmosphere calm. Later that evening, when everyone had gone home, I walked through the room slowly. The couch cushions were out of place. A child's sock lay abandoned near the hallway. The sink was full. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt content, because the mess belonged to joy, not tension. That distinction matters more than people realize. I also learned something unexpected about forgiveness. Forgiveness, I discovered, is not an event. It's not something you grant another person like a pardon. It's something you practice for yourself over and over until resentment no longer rents space in your body. I forgave Raymond the day I stopped explaining him. Not to others, to myself. The day I realized his choices were not reflections of my worth, but of his limitations. There's a kind of grief that comes with that realization, too. Grieving the version of the future you thought you were protecting by staying. Grieving the years you spent negotiating with silence. But grief, when honored properly, doesn't poison you. It clarifies you. I see that clarity now when I meet women who are still standing where I once stood. They talk about keeping the peace, about not wanting to make things worse, about waiting for the right moment to speak. I don't interrupt them. I listen because I know that place. And when they ask me, quietly, almost apologetically, "How did you know it was time?" I tell them the truth. I didn't, I say. I just knew it was time to stop pretending nothing was wrong. Sometimes that's all it takes. Not a plan, not a confrontation, just an honest acknowledgement that your silence has started to cost you more than your voice ever could. One afternoon, I found the remote control that Raymond used to keep on his side of the couch. It had slipped between the cushions, forgotten. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and smiled. It was such a small thing, a ridiculous thing even, but it represented something enormous. Control. Who gets to decide what stays on, what gets shut down, what deserves attention? I put it back on the table, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to. Choice feels like that now. Simple, undramatic, mine. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that first knock on the door, the moment everything changed. How easily I could have dismissed it, how tempting it would have been to stay quiet forever. And I understand now that courage doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like listening. Sometimes it looks like waiting just long enough for the truth to step forward so you don't have to chase it. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it's too late to reclaim yourself, let me answer you clearly. It's not. Not at your age, not in your situation, not after the years you've invested. You don't have to undo the past to choose yourself now. And you don't have to be loud to be powerful. All you have to do is stop abandoning yourself in moments where your spirit is asking to be acknowledged. The rest will follow. It always does.